why is it important for us in India to talk about CBAM or generally in the global south? Because we are quite resource heavy and we have a lot of iron and steel, metals and mining products, right, going out into the European Union. Right? I think this is data from 2024, where we see that almost 11,900 million USD worth of iron and steel has gone out. And this is just pure iron and steel, which we're talking about now. Products which include iron and steel, there was almost close to 10,000 million US dollars have gone out. Similar for aluminium products, right? So we do export a lot of metals, especially in the aluminium, iron and steel setup, and hence it is applicable to us, which is why we should take it up a little more seriously, right? Now, industry-wise, if you look at under the EU, industry-wise, EU does import almost 60% like of its imports were around steel, steel and aluminium. In fact, around 85% of the imports accounted for steel and aluminium. So for them also, from the European perspective, it becomes important, because if that is the amount you're importing on an annual basis, that means that is the amount of emissions you're transitioning to the global south and sort of blaming them for it, right? Or not necessarily paying the carbon tax on. Hence, these, again, heavily carbon intensive sectors, again, which have a lot of imports from beyond EU borders, have been considered in this. Now, for Indian exporters, this means that, hey, I have a lot more stricter trade and compliance requirements. Now, we are aware that governance in the European Union is a lot stricter, is a lot legitimate, a lot more streamlined as compared to the global south, right? Now, so EU importers will demand verified emissions data. They will sort of force Indian exporters to improve the carbon accounting, or, there could be a threat of like that we could risk losing a lot of contracts. I think a very similar example, considering we are, from the recent times, would be the US tariffs, how we are sort of in a difficult position, because it is a high possibility that all the garments exported from here would essentially go to Bangladesh and Vietnam right now, since we have almost 50% additional tariffs, right? So similar implications could happen when CBAM comes into full force. That is why we need to, as Indian exporters, we need to be prepared for any sort of market shift, right? So again, that moves us to the second point. If our exporters, if our MSME sector is not paying attention to these regulations, that means they will start looking at other companies. EU will start looking at other countries, other geographies to satisfy the demand, right, for the CBAM products. That means we could end up losing a lot of business from here. Now, because CBAM certificates will sort of increase export costs, it might make Indian goods a lot less competitive. That means we will have to start absorbing all of these costs or lose market share, which means that it is in our best interest to actually start not just tracking how much emissions we have, because if you don't track it rightly, we will lose out at the verification stage, but also start taking action to reduce these emissions that we have in our value chain, right? So maybe move towards alternate source of fuels, move towards alternate processes which have relatively less emissions. So in the short term, if you look at it, if you divide it up into short term and long term, in the short term, we see that there will be a lot more higher costs for us unless we actually decarbonize the supply chain. And so that will essentially impact the price competitiveness which we can give them right now. So that would be higher cost for us in the short term, and also because it is a compliance, that means there will be the compliance and operational burden, right? So as MSMEs, who we have generally seen to be not very pro-digitization in a lot of cases, they would need to invest a lot more money in emissions tracking or emissions or other processes to comply with CBAM, right? So otherwise, if they don't start investing in this, that would mean in the longer term, they would have to put in, like for non-compliance, they'll have to pay a lot more penalties or face a lot more rejections from the European Union, basically lose business. In the long term, what we see is, which is a positive impact which we'll have, is that we will as a country shift also to, and will be motivated to invest in cleaner technologies. So think about renewable energy, think about green hydrogen. Just to stay competitive, we will be sort of forced to move to a much lower carbon production or much lower carbon intensive value chain setup, right? And because it will pressure exporters to integrate sustainably across supply chain, we would also be forced to develop our own carbon pricing mechanisms, right? So that we avoid any sort of penalties in the European Union when we are exporting it there, which means that any industry which is actually polluting will now be forced, like the polluters pay principle will sort of come true, because they will be forced to pay a tax on it. And it's better that we pay that tax within the production country, so that money can be invested into low carbon production.